Welcome to Compromising Positions. I'm Leanne Potter, a cyber anthropologist and head of security operations for a major retailer.
And I'm Jeff Watkins, cybersecurity enthusiast and CTO for a major tech consultancy. Together, we are the tech podcast that asks non-cybersecurity professionals what we in the industry can do to make their lives easier. Today, we've got a super interesting interview with Christian Hunt, the founder of Human Risk. He's a behavioural science expert and author of the book Humanizing Rules, which explores how we can use behavioural science to improve compliance and ethics. In this interview, Christian shares his insights on how important it is to consider the humans behind compliance and cybersecurity. He explains that it's not just about following documentation, but also about the people who are responsible for ensuring compliance within an organisation.
Christian also talks about how we can use behavioural science techniques to encourage buy-in for ethics and compliance despite their negative reputation.
One of the key takeaways from the interview is the importance of designing things for how people actually behave, as opposed to how we'd like them to behave.
He also touches on the ethics of phishing simulations and how to measure the success of that training, and how people really feel about the rules they don't respect. So sit back and enjoy our interview with Christian Hunt. Well, welcome, Christian Hunt. I am so delighted for you to join us today. I have been a big fan of yours for ages, with your Human Risk podcast and your book, Humanizing Rules, which came out really recently, didn't it? Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Well, look, thank you firstly for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So I'm Christian Hunt. I'm the founder of a company called Human Risk that specializes in helping organizations to mitigate that risk. And that's all about bringing behavioral science into fields like ethics, compliance, risk, HR, legal, you name it. Thinking about the humans that we are trying to influence in order to do that. As you rightly pointed out, Leanne, I've recently authored a book called Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance. Out now, published by Wiley. Let's get that plug out of the way. But my interest is really in thinking about human beings. Whenever we think about the challenges of say, getting an organization to be compliant or cyber secure or whatever objective you're looking for an organization or society to achieve, it's all about influencing human beings. We have to think about the human beings, because you can't say to a company, be compliant and expect it to respond. It's the people within it that will determine whether or not that happens. So my focus is on behavioral science, the understanding of the real drivers of human decision making, and thinking about how we can deploy that intelligently to get the outcomes that we're looking for.
Amazing. I think that's so relevant to have you on as a guest for our show, because when I listen to your podcast, literally I'm always inspired to do another talk based on the guests you bring in and all the insights you bring to the show. I almost feel like, in a way though, that this episode is going to be a little bit of a cheat episode, because although you don't actually work in cybersecurity, your experience in regulation compliance kind of makes us a little bit like kindred spirits there. Because we're often a necessity in an organisation of cybersecurity, risk and compliance, but I'm sure some groans do follow you when you enter the chat, just like groans follow cybersecurity when they enter the chat. So how have you got buy-in for ethics and compliance, had to sort of really introduce this to organisations?
Yeah, so I think, I always say that compliance is the world's worst piece of branding, right? If you were trying to make something sound awful, you would use a word like compliance. Okay, it conjures up images of people, with some sort of jumped up little official with a clipboard, slavishly following pointless rules and getting you to do tedious procedures. So it's a terrible bit of branding. We make it even worse by then adding the suffix officer. Only time I could ever think of where the word officer actually makes it worse. And so, when I look at that, you're right, it does create these sort of groans. But what is fascinating about the objective that compliance has is that it's actually the same as lots of other things. Lots of people are trying to do the same thing. It's just in different contexts. Health and safety is similar to compliance in that you are trying to get people to follow rules. Cybersecurity is the same thing. It's human beings that you are trying to influence to behave, to do certain things or not do others. And so it's always great when I have conversations with people, because you're right, I come with this compliance badge and it is the world's worst piece of branding. But actually, when you look at the substance of it, it's very similar to other things. And what I find even funnier is that whenever I talk to people in companies, you always get this, we're very different, we're very unique, we have a unique business model, our sector's very unique. And of course, on one level, they're right. But actually, fundamentally, every single company and organization is employing human beings and therefore is facing the same challenge. So when I look at you can look at the form and say, well, it's totally different to anything else. But the substance of what I do is replicable across a broad range of industries. And the questions I'm asking about how do we persuade people to behave in a particular way? How do we force people to behave in a particular way? Those apply in a range of different disciplines. And so that's why, I've called my company Human Risk. The book is about humanizing rules. For me, the focus is on the humans, and whatever it is you want them to do or not do is, yes, it's important, of course, because that's your objective, but that's the secondary piece. We've got to focus on the human beings, and the human OS that we all come built with is the same. We're deploying the same thing, whether you're at work or in your personal life, or whether you're working in sector A, sector B, or whether there's risk A or risk B that we need to have you help us mitigate. It's all the same sort of thing. And that's what I like, coming at things from the human angle, as opposed to worrying too much about what is it that we want to get them to do. That matters, but the techniques that we can use, well, it's the same human beings we're trying to influence across the piece.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the rules and regulations and policies are often quite black and white. Having been part of a cybersecurity committee, we write rules and things that are you must not. But that doesn't reflect like the actual human experience of being part of an organization. What do you think organizations should be doing to encourage grey area thinking without actually risking their assets?
So I think the most important thing to do, and you've highlighted it beautifully there, Jeff, is to think about the realities that are there. We often design things, this is my big sort of theme, we often design things for how we would like people to behave rather than how they are likely to behave. And what I mean by that is we create stylized, simplified case studies or personas that we then use to write rules. And we love, as human beings, codifying things. If I can write things down, codify it, that feels like risk managed, job done, because I've told them what to do, and then things will happen. But of course, the real world is complex and challenging, and things don't always pan out the way we expect. And so what we have to do is recognize the realities of people's existence. And I think very often we don't do that. We train them on hypotheticals, often hypotheticals that will never happen. We look at the black and the white. We don't look at the gray areas. People generally, I always talk about, murder is bad type training, where we send people on training courses to teach them stuff that is blindingly obvious. And if they don't understand that blindingly obvious thing, then why have we hired them in the first place? Where people need help are those challenging areas, things they may not have come across, situations where what they encounter might look like it's an innocent situation, but actually there's things they need to be looking out for. We need to help real humans making real decisions in the real world. Now, that leads you to a challenge, because often when you start to recognize the realities that are out there, it becomes much harder to codify things. Now, if you're looking at something that involves the laws of physics, a simple example would be if you're talking about mixing water and electricity, that is a risk come what may. And therefore we can codify that, because what happens in the physical world is predictable. We know those things, broadly speaking. But when it comes to subjects like ethics or human decision making, we've got to start thinking about it. It's not a straightforward situation. What's appropriate in one situation might not be in another. And so because of these contextual challenges, because we have to recognize that people are flawed, they're tired, we're biased, we can often make decisions, well-intentioned decisions that can be bad. It's a lot harder to codify those things. And so this temptation to codify everything leads you down a route where, well, let's just simplify things. Let's make a set of principles. And so the question I think we should ask ourselves is the thing that we are trying to codify, is it codifiable? Therefore, should we have hard and fast rules? Does that make sense? And there are going to be certain things where you want to do that. You just want to tell people exactly what to do. And there's no negotiation, because them doing exactly what you tell them to do will always produce the right answer. On other occasions, we have to give them a bit of agency to think for themselves. And so the ways that you might mitigate one type of risk are not necessarily the ways you might try and mitigate another. Now, that makes the world of the person writing the rules and creating the processes to manage the risk a lot harder. But that, I think, is the honest challenge that we're facing. And all too often we take comfort from having hard codified rules because that looks good, nice. It's nice and simple. But actually that doesn't reflect the realities. And so it's bridging that gap between the theory that we'd love to have, which is a simple set of rules, and the realities of the complex world that we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as you were speaking then, it just reminded me how much in cybersecurity that we just love a hard and fast rule. And I think a lot of that's down to, historically, we've had to sort of say no to a lot of things because we've had to look after quite a big estate when the tooling hasn't really been there. It's only till, the last, 5-10 years that the tooling's really helped us be able to automate a lot of the stuff that human eyeballs just cannot physically keep an eye on. But I think that hard and fast rule still remains because of maybe sort of a self-preservationist attitude. saying no to a lot of things is easier when there's only 2 or 3 of you and a big team looking after a big organization from a cybersecurity perspective. How do you think, with that mindset still continuing, cybersecurity practitioners can think? I almost think it's a bit like sunken cost aversion. Like, they don't want to let go of things because they put so much effort into protecting these systems, and therefore they don't give their users autonomy.
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because if you've spent a lot of time working on or designing systems and processes, we know from behavioral science that if we invest time in something, that we value it. And that's a good thing, right? Because we don't want to think I've just spent years or months or hours doing something that's pointless. None of us believes that, otherwise we wouldn't have done it in the first place. So we have a sort of certain if you like, bias towards the processes that we have designed or implemented. And there are good evolutionary reasons why that makes sense. And so it's sometimes difficult to give up the ways that we have always done things. And I think one of the things to recognize is that whatever system we design will have, to use medical terminology, side effects. Of course, let's not forget that side effects don't actually exist. Side effects are effects, but they're just the ones that we don't want. So we call them side effects to make it convenient. I think starting to recognize that whatever approach you adopt or have been adopting will have side effects, not because you're an idiot, but because it's impossible often to codify every single thing. Recognizing that fact means that you can then start to say, actually, if it's not working 100% the way it's intended, that's not because I'm a complete idiot. It's maybe because I've missed something, or it's not possible to design the perfect thing. So recognizing that is a really key start point. And, to the extent that when I work with my clients, I always say to people, if you're going to bring in new rules, make the person who's writing the rule disclose the side effects, make them consciously aware, so that when you're introducing it, you're not thinking we have nailed this. You are thinking this is an experiment. And if we think about rules and processes where we're trying to influence human behavior, it is not like programming a machine. A machine will slavishly follow the rules it has been given, sometimes in ways that we didn't contemplate. But you've got a certainty there because you tell the machine to do it and it goes off and does it. Humans don't work in that way. And so what we should recognize is that any attempt to influence people, and I talk in my book about, it's called Humanizing Rules, but rules is just a proxy for rules, process, policies, procedures, training, communication. Any attempt to influence people's behavior, that is an experiment. And we need to think about it in experimental terms. And so there are going to be times when our experiments, things that we do with the best intentions, are going to fail or not work as well as we'd hoped. Equally, there will be times where we surprise ourselves in a positive sense and they work much better than expected. And if you want a good example of that, think about advertising. There are certain ad campaigns that are just shouldn't work. It's ridiculous. So in the UK, if we think about price comparison websites, you've got little sort of meerkats advertising that, or opera singers advertising it in ridiculous jingles. Now, on any logical level, people shouldn't be tempted to buy a product because they're spoken to by some fake animal or opera singer. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And yet clearly those ads work. Otherwise, they wouldn't keep doing them. So there's an example of something counterintuitive. And often when we're looking to influence human decision-making, counterintuitive things work. And we need to be open to that as well. So if we treat this whole exercise as an experiment and recognize that when we're going in, it is likely that there are going to be situations we haven't thought of, circumstances may change. Rules that we've created for the analog world, to use a sort of example, may not work in the digital world. What works well in one culture or country might not work in another. COVID's a great example of where presumptions that people had made about things turned out to not work in that particular situation. And so if we start to think in experimental terms, I think then it's much easier to say to ourselves, well, let's be honest about when it hasn't worked and recognize that it may not be possible to get 100% compliance or 100% of a particular outcome. And you can if you throw the kitchen sink at it, but we need to work out where do we want to do that and not. But I think adopting this experimental mindset feels really alien to people because it's sort of like it's admitting that we don't have all the answers and we'd love to have a simple solution, a job done. That is not how people work. And so that experimental mindset, recognizing that there are going to be side effects, that there are likely to be unintended consequences, if we're aware of that, we can look out for them, we can monitor for them, and that makes it more likely that we'll find the right answer, or we won't continue to blunder down a path that's clearly not working.
Really interesting point. You just said there, monitoring. I think measurement in software and also in the people involved in software, because when we implement software metrics, I'd say a good chunk of them actually really are about the people, and that becomes really problematic. Whereas your example of the advert, well, you can measure some really solid metrics on whether or not an advertisement campaign is working. But how in the past have you dealt with kind of measuring the human element when you are running an experiment?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? So I talk a lot about we can learn from marketing, because marketing is obviously the business of influencing people, right? We spend money on ad campaigns to persuade people to buy a product or service, or in the case of governments, to behave in a particular way. And so if you then transfer that logic across, which I think is valid, you then say to yourself, okay, well, how do I know that I've been successful? Marketing is obvious because I will sell more of it may not be 100% down to the ad campaign, but you've got some form of visibility on how successful you're being. When your objective is to prevent bad things from happening, often there is no evidence. You know when it's gone wrong, but you don't necessarily know when it's going right. And of course, the worst, what you don't want to do is to sort of wait and say, well, we'll judge the success of this by nothing we've seen going wrong. That doesn't feel particularly safe. It's just waiting for something to happen to prove that you're out there trying to prove a negative. And so one of the things to think about is to say, well, what are the human objectives that we're trying to deliver? And often what we do is we look at the data sets that are convenient to us. So here's a good example. If we think about training, one of the things that we measure the success of training is how many people turned up to do the training, right? Either in person or online. A bum on a seat, or fingers on a keyboard, or eyes on a screen. Now it feels like a logical metric to measure. 100% of people did the training, job done. Well, just because 100% of people showed up doesn't mean they've understood what you're telling them, doesn't mean they've accepted what you tell them. Okay, so how can we test that? Well, then the next logical thing we do is we test them seconds after we've taught them something. And we say, we regurgitate some facts, and then we test things that are easy to test. And in my world of compliance, it's often questions like, failure to comply with this rule will see you go to jail for 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. Right? Easy to test. What a ridiculous question, right? I don't want anybody ever going, oh, well, this rule's a 5-year and that's a 20-year. I better not break the 20-year rule, but the 5-year one, that's the one I'm going to breach. Right? It's stupid information. No one needs to know. You just need to know the consequences of not doing this are severe. That's about it. But we test those basically. We're not testing actual comprehension. And so I think we can take a lesson here out of teachers in schools and think about, are we just teaching people to pass an exam? Or do we want them to genuinely understand something? And if we want them to genuinely understand something, then we need to start thinking about, well, how could we measure that level of understanding? And then you get into the realms of, for example, phishing campaigns. Now, I think that's a really interesting idea that's not deployed in many other contexts. Now, partly because it is, if you think about it, a little bit unethical. So what we're doing is we're putting people in a position where you've set up, basically entrapment, right? You've set them up in a situation. And then what you do is when they fail your phishing test, you go, ha, you're bad. We've caught you. And there are lots of ethical questions about whether that makes sense. But the thinking behind it, I think, is sensible, which is the only way I'm going to have a handle on whether people within the organization are likely to fall for this, is to put them in a position where I can find out whether that's the case or not. Now, for me, the ethics in it comes in the way you handle it, not necessarily in setting up the scenario. And if you actually treated people decently and recognized that even the best intentioned human can get things wrong, then you could probably set that exercise up in a way that was a bit more ethical and was a bit more supportive and collaborative. So less of an entrapment exercise and more of a training one. But the reason I like the philosophy behind it, if not always the execution, is that what that recognizes is the only way I can find this out is to test it out for real. And that does two things. One is it puts your employees in a real life situation, or what they think is a real life situation if you do it well. But the second thing is you've then got a proper handle on the risk. You are measuring actually whether people are responding to these situations. What you then do with that is a secondary phase. But I think that's a good example of saying, okay, what is the behavioral outcome that we are looking for? And have we been successful in achieving that? So you're testing the actual thing that you want people to do or not do, rather than testing the theory as to whether they ought to do it. And I come back to that. We need to look, to think about not what we would like people to do, but what they are likely to do. How do we find out what they're likely to do? Well, we try and replicate the scenarios where we can watch that. Now, there are lots of examples of that where you can't do it. We don't want to put temptation in people's paths. It's not acceptable. It's not the right process. But the thinking behind it of saying, if I really want to know whether I've mitigated the risk, is I need to look at the people and try and understand what they will do in certain situations, then that's a really good start point. There are other things we can look at. For example, if there's a particular rule that is complex, where you would say, actually, if somebody's going to need to comply with this rule, they're going to need to understand the detail. And therefore, we might say to ourselves, are they inquiring for themselves? Are they asking the questions? So if there's a rule that you need to ask questions to be able to comply, I don't know, there are limits or things you need approvals for. Are we getting people asking for that at a time when we would expect it? So gifts and entertainment at Christmas is a good compliance example. As you approach the holiday season, people are more likely to be giving and receiving gifts. Therefore, that policy becomes more prevalent. Are people asking questions about that? Are they looking at that particular rule at that time of year? Doesn't necessarily mean that they're not complying with it if they're not, but it's a good leading indicator. And so one of the things I talk about in my book is using people as a radar. And often what we do is we use people, the evidence of non-compliance as a sort of, that's the test. So when it has gone right or it's gone wrong, where we can obviously measure that. But there are lots of other things, the interactions that we have with people where we can start to see things. Somebody complaining a lot about a particular rule. And I don't just mean one person, but take a broad sway. Lots of people, if one person complains about something, it's less of an issue. Lots of people are complaining about it. Then it's worth having a look at that rule, because lots of people complaining about a particular rule tells you they don't like it. Which rules are they likely to bend when push comes to shove? Answer is ones they have no respect for. So complaints about rules, we often tell people to go away and shut up. That's the way it has to be. And I'm not saying you listen to every single one, but if there's a wall of complaints about a particular rule or process or system, people go, oh, this system's tedious, clunky, keeps breaking down. Well, that's a leading indicator as to where something might go wrong. So rather than just using people as evidence that it hasn't worked, we can start to tap into things that they do, questions they ask, their behaviors before things go wrong that could, and we have to be really careful about how we interpret the data, that could be indicative of a problem down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing the sort of cybersecurity industry doesn't do very well is giving justifications for the controls they put in place. Quite often it's, well, we're security, we said so. That's why you're blocked from this website. That's why you're blocked from this, without any form of dialogue or discussion. And often the controls that cybersecurity practitioners put in place, it isn't through consultation. It is a response to the threat landscape. Whether or not that's a threat landscape that is tailored to that organization, thinking contextually, like, is this an actual threat to us, or is it just a general threat to any organization? What's the likelihood of that risk occurring? And then putting those controls in place without sort of going, oh, actually, Bob, the developer, needs to be able to access this system to be able to do his job and actually make the business profitable. And I think sometimes we forget that disconnect. But some of that, I think, is down to the fact that we don't allow a lot of psychological safety to have these discussions with the cybersecurity team, to sort of challenge them and say, well, why are you doing it this way? Why can't I be involved? Because some of the cybersecurity decisions are secret in a way. So how would you suggest go about breaking down those sort of psychological safety and silos in that way?
So I think you made a really, really good point early on, Leanne, which I think is worth just highlighting, which is about human beings are sentient. So when we force rules on them, force training on them, restrict what they can do, they will react to that. We will have a view on that. We've all come across rules that we think are dumb. We all break rules every single day. And so when we come across someone that has decided on our behalf that we can't do something, generally speaking, we'll find that irritating unless we understand the reasons why. And the classic one I always used to cite was in banks. And I don't know if this is still the case, but very often they used to block all video websites, right? Very simple. And when I was heading up compliance, I was like, I want to find out why, right? I'm a little bit mischievous with these things. And so I always like to find out why did rules. So I went and investigated. And I was told on several occasions, the reason that YouTube was blocked was it started off with bandwidth arguments, which I might buy under certain circumstances. I could see that bandwidth needs to be throttled, and you don't, during the World Cup or something, you don't necessarily want everybody to be streaming that kind of thing. But I think it's less of an issue now than it was before. So let's park that as a legit excuse. You then get into we don't want people watching inappropriate content. And I said, well, who's to judge what's inappropriate and what's not? And then it came down to, we don't want people spending their whole days watching cat videos. To which I say two things. One is, if somebody's spending their whole days watching cat videos, that's not a YouTube problem. That's a supervision issue. There's a bigger issues than there. And actually, does it matter if somebody wants to spend 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes watching a cat video, if that gives them joy and makes them laugh, right? How is that detrimental? And in any case, they can do it on their own personal devices anyway. So who are we to police this kind of stuff? And I said, we should be thinking much more sensitive about it, because if you block YouTube just as a sort of proxy for all these other risks, then what you're doing is stopping people accessing stuff that's really useful for work. And you don't know what that is. There's tons of training courses, video, things that might seem, particularly in the field that I'm in, there's lots of things that you can watch that actually teach you a lot about human decision making, and they're good for creativity and those sorts of things. And just by blanket going, well, we don't want YouTube, you are potentially shutting that off. And so you don't necessarily see the downside to these things because you don't know what it is they might be watching. And it sends a huge signal to employees that you don't trust them. And whenever we're in a position where somebody effectively signals that you're not trusted, then you're going to respond in kind. And I don't think that's a healthy relationship between employer and employee to basically go, well, we can't trust you not to do inappropriate things, so we'll just have a blanket prohibition. It's a little bit like the parental logic of just do what I say, right? No negotiation. And I know why parents use that, because you get to a point where you have nothing else to reach for. But if you do that as an employer to adults, that poses problems. And so I think we shouldn't allow any function within one organization to have the sort of power that allows them, whatever the opposite of a golden ticket, a golden veto is on things. We should be escalating. The legal function does this quite a lot. You need to get approval from legal before it can happen. Well, why should legal have some kind of override on decisions that are made in the business? Because the answer is legal wants to make legal's life as easy as possible, right? So they'll look at it and say, what we want to do is, if we go to court on this one, we want to make sure it's buttoned up, so we're going to control what you do. I would be saying, okay, that's going to happen in a very small percentage of situations. Is the cost of that worth all the other imposition that you're imposing on lots of other people and how it makes them feel? And we allow legal to do that in their way. I think you're right. We also allow sort of decisions to be made by people who, with best intentions, none of this is meant to criticize people making a decision, which have unintended consequences. So I do think organizations need to start recognizing that when we give people too much power, when they're mitigating a risk, they will do everything they can to mitigate that risk. But if you take it to a logical extremity, what's the best way to protect an organization from cyber risk is not have any computers, right? Let's not give anyone access to any systems whatsoever. Ditto, physical security will say no buildings, right? HR might say we don't employ any people. They will mitigate those risks. We don't allow that to happen. We say these are the risks that are here. You need to help us mitigate them. And there are going to be times where we're going to say, no, I know it make life easier for you, but that's not acceptable. That impinges on other aspects of employment. And I think that's not been thought through fully, because actually, if we irritate employees in one context, compliance is a good example, but you could say, being ridiculously petty with cyber issues and making people do silly things there has an impact on how I feel about working for this particular organization. And if I start to perceive the organization has stupid rules that I don't respect, then actually it might not be a cyber rule that gets my wrath. I may well go, well, screw them, and I'll find any opportunity to exact my revenge. And that might be in some other context. So all of this feeds into the employee experience. And I think it's just important for organizations to recognize that people managing risk, if you incentivize them to do everything that's convenient for them, that comes at a cost elsewhere. And so we should be having these discussions and saying, yes, of course, we need to mitigate the risk, but there's got to be a path where we risk accept that we're not going to be able to nail everything down. So work out what it is that's absolutely essential. And then you say, well, this would be nice to have, but if that impinges normal business practices, maybe we'll have to think about it differently. But those discussions don't happen.
Wow, there's so much good stuff in this interview that we had to make this a two-parter. So follow the show wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss out on the second episode where Christian Hunt uses his Humans framework to help us get the most out of stopping people click on potential phishing attacks.
Links to everything Christian discussed in the episode can be found in the show notes. And if you like the show, please do leave us a review, share on LinkedIn or with your teams. It really helps us spread the word and get high-quality guests in like Christian for future episodes.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Keep safe, keep secure, and don't forget to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here?